Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Motes. On today's episode, we wrap up the Hand of Thrawn duology. Leia, Han, and Lando try to stop the New Republic from erupting into civil war, as Admiral Pellaeon searches for evidence that Moff Disra is trying to usurp the Imperial throne. Meanwhile, Luke and Mara discover a new threat, one that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. It's Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn. And returning to talk about the book with me today are Crystal and Thomas from the TK331 podcast. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us again.
Yeah, a lot of fun last time. Should be a lot of fun this time.
If folks haven't heard of TK331 or they would like to sample the show, can you give a little bit about what they could expect to hear?
Sure. So we're all like you. We're a Legends podcast. We started with the Truce of Bakura several years ago, and for the most part, have just been going forward in the timeline ever since. We've jumped backwards a few times, doing things like the Kenobi novelization. We recently actually just did the Outbound Flight, which is discussed in these two books, and yeah, just a lot of fun talking about Star Wars.
It's the year of Timothy Zahn.
It is the season of Zahn
In both of our shows.
Yeah, we're both, all three of us are fans of Zahn. He's not perfect, but there are few who write Star Wars like he does, which is usually a good thing.
Well, I'm excited to talk more about today's book with you two, but first, it's listener question time. We have 2 emails today. The first comes from Benjamin, who says, "Hello, Aaron. If you were a Sith, who would you have wanted as your master, and who would you have wanted as your apprentice? Same question if you were a Jedi. Also, what do you think of the Dune series? Your likes and dislikes. Go A's." Well, thank you, Benjamin, for the email. I do not thank you for your A's beating the O's in their 3-game series out in Oakland. Let's answer your second question first. Benjamin, I can't really speak much about the Dune series. I've never read any of Frank Herbert's books. I've seen the 1984 movie by David Lynch, but I haven't watched the newer films. So, Crystal, Thomas, do you have any opinions about Dune?
You go first. You've got the shorter answer here.
Yeah, Tom's the Dune guy. I've read the first book. I've watched the newer films. The story is just not to my taste. If you can believe it, I actually fell asleep in the theater in the middle of the second one of the newer ones. That was partially because I was really tired, but truly incredible. It's clearly just not my thing.
Whereas I'm a big fan of Dune. I first read it when I was, I think, in middle school. I read it again in high school. I've read it multiple times since then. I was actually just counting on our bookshelf. So we own the original 6 novels by Frank Herbert. And after he passed away, he was always going to write Dune 7, but never got a chance to finish it. And so years later, his son, Brian Herbert, and Star Wars author Kevin J. Anderson got together and decided that they were going to write Dune 7 based on Herbert's old notes. So they wrote Dune 7 and actually split it into 2 novels because it was too long for one book. They also wrote several other books together. There were the House books, which are the House trilogy, which is right before Dune. There's the Butlerian Jihad, which is thousands of years before Dune. I think it's like 10,000 years before Dune or something like that. It's their Dawn of the Jedi, if you will. And they've also written several books in between the 2 different eras and even within the original 6 books. So we own currently 19 Dune books. I last read all these 8-10 years ago, and at the time, that was all the Dune books that had come out. There are newer ones that have come out since then I have not read yet. I look forward to getting them someday and reading them. I think it's a fascinating universe, and it has a huge impact on Star Wars and just science fiction in general. It's one of the seminal works of science fiction. And if you read Dune and you watch Star Wars, like, oh yeah, there's a lot there that are influences. And I'm sorry you watched the David Lynch movie. It's not very good, but also it does depend on which version you've seen. I saw it once years ago, and it was whatever version Blockbuster had on VHS at the time to rent, so I couldn't tell you, because I know that what was released to the general public was not what Lynch wanted it to be. It was a severely edited and cut down version of what he had made, and I don't think what he made has actually ever been released in its entirety, and that I would actually be very interested in seeing, because I always want to see what the artist wanted to create and not what the studio chopped down and butchered. That being said, it still wasn't a very good movie because of just some of the choices he made in the story. I like the newer films. I think the casting is great, and also they do a good job of showing that you can't just adapt a story completely straight. There are some big differences between the newer movies and the story, especially the ending of Dune Part 2. Very different than the first Dune book. And actually, I'm actually a big fan of the old sci-fi miniseries from the early 2000s, where they did like 6 hours of adapting the Dune story, and it is to a fault accurate to the book. Unfortunately, it's not very well acted. It's not a very high budget, but I love what it does. That was the first time I saw something. I was like, oh wow, this is the story I read on page translated to screen. It's not very good, but I love it for actually doing that in a way that almost no other story has ever done. But the first 3 books for Dune are well worth reading. They're fantastic. The 4th book is it jumps the shark completely, is what I will say. I wasn't a big fan of it, but the 5th and 6th books were interesting.
So Benjamin, that's 1 thumbs up from Thomas, 1 thumbs down from Crystal, and I can't give you a thumbs either way because I have not partaken. Now back to your first question. Who would you want as your master and your apprentice if you were a Sith or if you were a Jedi? Crystal, I'll let you answer this one first.
If I was a Jedi, I think I would pick Qui-Gon as my master. I have a connection to Qui-Gon and his flouting of the Jedi Council's ridiculous ways. I think for an apprentice, I would pick Ahsoka, just because I love her. I don't have a good other reason for that. If I was a Sith...
That's the only reason you need.
Yeah, I don't need to explain myself here. If I was a Sith, I think it would be interesting to have Darth Zana as a master, but I had a really hard time thinking of who I would have as an apprentice. It's really hard for me to imagine any of the Sith as apprentices, even though like that's part of the deal. So I just couldn't really land on one.
Thomas?
For me, my master, I actually want my master to be Ahsoka, but I want her to be the younger Ahsoka, so closer to Clone Wars era than the Ahsoka TV show era. And then my apprentice, I'd actually want to be Tahiri from the Junior Jedi Knights books.
Oh.
I think she's just a really fun character who has a lot going for her, and I think she'd be a fun apprentice to have. For the Sith side, my apprentice would be Darth Bane, so I could claim to have at least influenced the rule of 2.
You'd be dead.
I know. We'd all be dead regardless on the Sith side, so I can at least claim some part of history.
Okay.
For my master, I don't really have one. Maul might be kind of fun.
Oh, that's a good pick.
Yeah, so I guess I'd say Maul for my master, before he gets cut in half.
Or after.
He's not a Sith then, though.
So for me, as a Jedi, if she ever achieved the rank of Jedi Master, I would want Leia to be my master.
Oh.
I
good choice.
think not only would it be... she would have fascinating opinions about the Force and what a Jedi needs to be, but she would think outside of the Jedi Order in order to, solve problems, solve situations. I think an apprentice, that one's more difficult for me. Grogu. He doesn't talk back much,
Yes.
I have
He's not entered his teenage years yet.
Right. And I have a little bit of an issue with that with my niece and nephew. So I'll go with Grogu. As far as Sith is concerned, I would like Maul to be my master because one of the things with the rule of 2 is eventually the apprentice is supposed to try to destroy the master. And I don't think Maul is that smart. I think he would possibly be the easiest person.
You think you could take him?
Once he taught me everything he knew, I think I could take him.
Okay.
And a little bit of Maul in my second answer, because I think he was on the right track trying to make Ezra his apprentice. If I was the master, I would want Ezra as my apprentice.
Okay.
That's a good pick.
Yeah. Darth Ezra.
Yeah, Darth Ezra.
Or whatever silly name he picks.
Darth Airvent.
Darth Jabba.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Today's second email comes from Dawson. Dawson says, "Hello, Aaron. In the Black Fleet Crisis, we see Luke seeming to retreat a bit from teaching students to get back in touch with the Force, and it got me thinking. On your show, you've covered several different portrayals of Luke and his relationship with the Force, from first learning about it in A New Hope to full-blown Jedi Master at the end of the New Jedi Order, with plenty of development in between. You've also said that Luke, specifically post-Return of the Jedi, is one of the toughest characters to write for in Legends." Sounds like Dawson heard our conversation about Luke and writing him after Return of the Jedi. "I was curious if you had a favorite portrayal of Luke or a point in Luke's Force journey that you prefer over others. I read the Mara Jade Hand of Judgment duology a few months ago and wasn't a huge fan of Luke's stage of Force development in those books, but I did enjoy him having to show his resourcefulness in other ways as a rebel operative." Great question, Dawson. Of course, the Hand of Judgment duology takes place shortly after Luke begins his Force journey. So he doesn't really know a whole lot at that point in time. I would say my favorite portrayal of Luke is simply Luke in the throne room in Return of the Jedi. Because I think occasionally some Star Wars fans misunderstand what Luke is trying to do there. Luke is not trying to destroy the Emperor and basically destroy the Empire. I know that's how the Legends in universe make it sound, that Luke destroyed Darth Vader and the Emperor and saved everyone. But Luke is there to save his father's soul. That's the only reason Luke goes in there. He's trying to help someone. And I think that's my favorite portrayal of Luke in his Force journey.
Yeah. I can't really top that. I also just prefer that era of Luke, Return of the Jedi Luke, and I think he gets really far afield in the 90s, especially the way that different authors write him. I think if I was going to pick something from that era, I would pick the original Thrawn trilogy for how he's portrayed. He's a little OP, and there's some stuff that he does that is a little questionable with how he shields his presence from other people. He when they're on that Star Destroyer sneaking around, but at the same time, it's nothing compared to some other stuff that he does in other places, like in the Crystal Star when he's doing a full-on, I've made a Force illusion around me and you have no idea what I look like. And I think there's a kind of similar, throne room scene vibe there at the end of the Thrawn trilogy.
So I would agree with you, Aaron. The throne room scene is peak Luke. That's why he's my favorite character in Star Wars, is because of that scene. But looking at the books, I actually kind of have a weird answer here. It's not one author or one story I can point to. It's different authors putting Luke in the quiet moments. In the second book of the Young Jedi Knight series called Shadow Academy, he has some just fascinating conversations with Tenel Ka about the Force and its nature, and what separates the light from the dark is what they do and how they use it. And it's when he's talking like that, when an author gets that part of him right, I love those little moments like that. Or in, I know you haven't done this, but in the Battlefront 2 video game, there's a really great scene between Luke and Del Meeko, I think is the character's name, who's at the time an Imperial, and Luke doesn't kill him. He lets him go, and Del's like, "I'm your enemy, why aren't you killing me?" And Luke just gives this great speech about just what it means to have compassion for other beings, and it really actually sets Del down a path of breaking away from the Empire because of what Luke tells him in this moment. So I just really love when authors, regardless of the story, regardless of the era, regardless of EU versus Disney, really focus on Luke and those really quiet moments talking about the Force and the difference between the light and the dark and why he cares about everyone. And I think all that stems from that scene in the throne room with his father.
Great question, Dawson. Listener, if you have a question for the podcast, send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message and email it in, but please record it in MP3 audio format. Now it's time for today's book, Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn, the final book in the Hand of Thrawn duology. Now, listener, one thing about today's show, overall, the three of us are big fans of the way Timothy Zahn writes Star Wars, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, overall.
Great character work, great plot, a lot of plot.
Exactly. This book is nearly 700 pages long. I think it's the longest book in Star Wars Legends. Thomas?
It is. There was a tweet a couple of years ago. I think it was at Darth Infernus. He's an editor at Lucasfilm, and he said, "This is by word count. This is the longest Star Wars book, and I believe Star by Star in the New Jedi Order is the second longest Star Wars book." Because someone was asking if one of the new Thrawn books was the longest, and the end of the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, I think it's like the third or fourth longest Star Wars book, but this still tops that.
Well, there is a lot of plot in this book, and we'll talk about the main events, but we're not going to go over everything in the story. If you want to hear a more in-depth discussion about the events of Vision of the Future, you can check out the 2-part episode Crystal and Thomas did about this book on the TK331 podcast back in January and February of 2024. Okay?
It's about 4 hours long between those two episodes, give or take.
Great. Listener, Thomas, Crystal, grab yourselves a drink, and let's head into the Star Wars Legends Lounge.
The story begins on the Relentless. Moff Disra, Major Tierce, and Flim receive a call from an ambassador from the planet Kroktar. The Kroktari have heard that Grand Admiral Thrawn has returned, and they want to meet him. In fact, they want to join him and the Empire. Disra is surprised at the request, but Tierce says the Kroktari aren't the only group to call. There are dozens of old feuds popping up across the New Republic, and several planets are yearning for the stability they enjoyed under the Empire. Flim slips into his Thrawn portrayal and invites the Kroktari aboard to talk about leaving the New Republic and joining the Imperial Remnant.
Luke and R2 arrive at Nurawan to search for Mara. Luke leaves the Jade's Fire hidden in orbit and takes his X-Wing down to the area of Mara's last transmission. With the help of the native sentient bat-like creatures, Luke finds Mara in a cave. She tells him about the strange starfighters and the transmission she followed here, a message that contained Grand Admiral Thrawn's full name. How do you say it, honey?
Oh, you're not going to get me to say that.
Mithran Nuadu?
You say it better.
Mara says that she's discovered what's going on in the fortress above them. Because of Thrawn's set up a contingency after his invasion 10 years ago, it could be devastating for the New Republic.
Talon Karrde travels to the Cathal system deep in the Outer Rim. He's looking for his former mentor, George Cardass. Karrde hopes that Cardass has information about the destruction of Kaemas, maybe even has his own copy of the Kaemasi document. Karrde, 3PO, and the former Mistral Shadow Guard, Shada Dukal, land on the planet Dayark. They find an odd little man named Entu Ni, who seems to be working for Cardass. Entu Ni doesn't really answer any of Karrde's questions, but he does invite the smuggler to head to Exocron, a planet hidden inside a giant gas cloud where Karrde will find the answers to all of his questions.
Meanwhile, warships are gathering around Bothawi. Half of the forces say they want to force the Bothans to face justice for their roles in the destruction of Kaemas, and the other half are there to defend the Bothans, saying you can't hold an entire species responsible for the actions of a few people. But they're really here to settle old feuds, like the Ashori and the Diamala. Leia and President Gavrisum are trying to keep the peace, but tensions are rising. Leia says the only thing that might keep the New Republic from destroying itself is to find a complete version of the Kaamasi document. And the only way to do that will be to find the capital of the Imperial Remnant, Bastion. Han volunteers to find Bastion and enlists Lando and Lobot to go along.
Luke and Mara sneak into the dark fortress on Nirwan. There's a brief firefight, but seems to be a misunderstanding. The blue-skinned aliens they find invite Mara to talk, to learn what they're doing here at the edge of wild space. Luke is reluctant, but Mara heads in. She meets a former Imperial captain who discovered Thrawn during the Clone Wars. She also meets Baron Soontir Fel, the former Imperial TIE fighter pilot and former member of Rogue Squadron. The two introduce Mara to the Chiss, Thrawn's species. Park says they've been here for years, watching and gathering information about dangers in the unknown region that can threaten the New Republic. When Mara asks why Park has never contacted Coruscant, he says they've been waiting for Thrawn's return to see which side he would choose. And now that Thrawn is back, they will soon contact Bastion and turn all the information they have over to the Empire.
Leia continues to keep the peace on Bothawi when a ship arrives from Coruscant. It's Kaamasi ambassador Eligos Akla, and he's got the New Republic's top slicer, Ghent, with him. Eligos says that Ghent intercepted a message for General Garmbel Iblis from the Supreme Commander of Imperial Forces, Admiral Gilad Pellaeon, and he wants to negotiate a peace treaty. Leia is skeptical, but if the message is true, it's too important to ignore. Eligos invites himself and Ghent along. They transfer to the Falcon and head off to meet with Pellaeon.
Card finds Cardass on Exocron, and the reunion is disappointing. Instead of a cunning, dangerous information broker, Card and Shada find a senile, elderly man. Card quickly realizes he won't get any useful information from his former mentor. He decides to go back to Coruscant, but his ships become trapped. A Rhodian pirate named Rikas followed Card to find and kill Cardass. Rikas has an impressive fleet. His ships outnumber Card and the Exocron defenses 3-1. Card apologizes to Shada for getting her into this situation. They prepare the wild card for battle when suddenly 3 enormous alien battlecruisers just appear behind the pirate fleet. The cruisers fire a strange weapon that cuts straight through the pirate ships, slicing them in half. The battle is over in moments. Card and Shada are speechless, stunned at what they just witnessed. Then they receive a message. It's from George Cardass, inviting him to return to the planet's surface, and a chance to talk.
Han, Lando, and Lobot discover Bastion and use an old smuggling trick to sneak down to the planet's surface. They head to the Imperial Library and break into its database, but their slicing sets off internal alarms. Tierce and Disra decide that now's the time to take their plan to the next level. The Imperials chase our heroes back to the spaceport where they're confronted by Grand Admiral Thrawn. The Admiral says he wants the same thing that Han wants, to see the guilty Bothans brought to justice and to stop a war. Thrawn hands Han a data card containing the Imperial copy of the Kaamasi document and allows our heroes to leave Bastion.
Leia arrives at Pisidian and meets with Admiral Pellaeon. She asks if the Admiral was serious in wanting peace. Pellaeon says yes, the war is over, the Empire has lost. Pellaeon asks for information about the aide he sent to contact General Bel Iblis. When Leia says she doesn't know anything about that, Ghent speaks up. He says Pellaeon's aide was captured before he could deliver the Admiral's message by an Imperial Star Destroyer, the Relentless. Disra, Pellaeon says. The Admiral asks Leia to take his proposal to President Gavrisum while he takes Ghent to Yaga Minor. The Slicer can look into what information Disra sent Tierce to find there. Meanwhile, Pellaeon says it's time to have a discussion with the Moff.
Luke watches Mara enter some sort of command room with the Imperials. When the doors close, his sense of her vanishes. Luke starts to panic, but he quickly realizes what happened. Isal Amiri, of course. The Imperials must have surrounded the room with Isal Amiri. Luke and R2 move around the fortress, taking out the force-repelling reptiles. He kills the last one and then slashes into the command room. He tosses Mara her lightsaber, and together the two fight their way through the fortress to the hangar bay. They use their sabers to sabotage the parked ships, steal the last one, and return to the jungle where Luke parked his X-Wing. Luke asks Mara what the Imperials wanted. She says they weren't really Imperials. They called themselves the Empire of the Hand. She says they're guarding against threats from the unknown regions and waiting for Thrawn to return to lead them. Mara says if they turn over all their intelligence to Bastion, the Empire could destroy the New Republic. It's up to her and Luke to make sure that doesn't happen.
Han and Lando return to Bothwy just after Leia. The three meet to discuss what to do with Han's data card containing the Kayamasi document. They discover that the data card has been altered, a trick from Grand Admiral Thrawn. Leia says there's still time for Card to return with a copy of the document, but they need to buy time. She tells Lando to find Senator Miyatamia and ask him to stand down the Diamalan fleet. She'll do the same for the Ashori. And Han, well, Han will hold on to the data card and do what he does best. Bluff and tell all the surrounding warships that he won't turn over the document until tensions calm down.
Meanwhile, General Garm Bel Iblis has his own idea on how to end hostilities at Bothawui. He's going to lead a small task force to Yaga Minor to get an Imperial copy of the Kayamasi document. He commandeers the errant venture from Booster Tarek and jumps to hyperspace with Rogue Squadron and a few other fighter wings in tow. Bel Iblis's plan is to use the Star Destroyer to get as close to the Yaga Minor base as possible before the Imperials figure out what's happening, and then send in troops to steal the information he needs. It'll probably be a one-way trip, and both Bel Iblis and Booster know it.
Mara convinces Luke to enter a healing trance before they return to the Hand of Thrawn. Mara says he needs rest, and she needs him at his best in order to complete their mission. Luke relents, but as soon as he enters the trance, Mara takes the remote for the Jade's Fire from Luke's X-Wing and heads off to the fortress alone. When Luke awakens 5 hours later, he finds Mara has gone. He calls out to her with the Force and discovers she's actually close by, sitting at the top of the cliff overlooking his X-Wing. Luke asks Mara what she's doing. She asks him to sit down beside her and then points up at the sky. Luke watches as the Jade's Fire descends through the clouds. Turbo lasers fire from the fortress, trying to shoot it down. When Luke asks what's going on, Mara tells him that she went back to the hangar. She hid the remote, calling her ship down from orbit. Now Luke understands what's happening. Mara leans against him, and the two watch in silence as the Jade's Fire slams into the hangar, destroying any chance for the Hand of Thrawn to send a messenger to the Imperial remnant.
On Exokron, Card and Shada meet George Cardass again. But he looks completely different this time. Gone is the feeble man from before. The George Cardass standing in front of them now seems healthy and vibrant. Cardass apologizes to Card for the deception, but he needed to use Card to lure Recos to Exokron and into the territory of the Ang-Ti monks. Cardass says the Ang-Ti hate slavers. When Recos entered their part of the Cathal Rift, they opened themselves up to attack from the monks. Cardass says he's proud of Card and how he has grown Cardass's former organization. Cardass says he doesn't have a copy of the Kayamasi document, but he does have some information that he says will help Card stop the Imperial remnant.
The battle finally begins at Bothawui. An Imperial intelligence team brings down the planetary shield. Half of the ships move into position to bombard the capital, while the other half moves in to stop them. In the chaos, Leia gets a feeling that another danger is lurking just at the edge of the system. Han discovers 3 Imperial Star Destroyers hiding beneath the cloaking shield, just waiting to mop up the survivors of the upcoming battle. Leia uses the Force to take control of the helm of the Ashuri flagship. She convinces the commander to attack the Imperials, while Lando does the same with the Diamala. When the other New Republic ships see what's happening, they stop firing on each other and turn their weapons on the Imperials, forcing the Star Destroyers to retreat.
Luke, Mara, and R2 sneak back into the Hand of Thrawn fortress and discover a hidden chamber. Inside the room, they find a computer terminal and a cloning cylinder containing a nearly finished clone of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Luke tells R2 to download any information the little droid can get on the Hand of Thrawn, and then he and Mara advance on the cylinder to kill the clone. As they approach, the room's defenses kick in. They're attacked by a pair of Guardian droids. The droids box in Luke and Mara, but the two open themselves up, joining together in the Force. Mara destroys one of the droids and then slashes through one of the walls, flooding the chamber and destroying the other Guardian. Luke and Mara escape the chamber by blowing the cloning cylinder. The explosion opens the hole in the wall even more, and they let the rushing water carry them out of the fortress and into the caves below. When they get back to Luke's X-Wing, R2 begins chirping excitedly. Apparently, the Hand of Thrawn had a complete copy of the Kayamasi document, and R2 has downloaded it.
The errant adventurer arrives at Yaga Minor, but so does the Relentless. The fake Grand Admiral Thrawn orders the Relentless to destroy General Bell Bliss, but just then Admiral Paleon and Talon Card arrive. The information provided by George Cardos exposes Flim the conman, and it talks about one of the Emperor's secret programs cloning members of his Imperial Guard, like Major Grodin Tierce. Paleon takes Flim and Moff Disra into custody, while Shadow subdues Tierce. Then, the Imperial Commander of Imperial Forces officially surrenders to General Bell Bliss. The story ends with Paleon negotiating a peace treaty with President Gaversom. Luke returns with Thrawn's copy of the Kayamasi document, allowing the New Republic to bring the remaining living perpetrators to trial. Leia and Han reunite with their children and Chewbacca to plan their long-awaited family vacation. And Mara agrees to marry Luke. She wants to build a life with a Jedi Master, but Mara's not too keen to become a teacher at the Jedi Academy on Yavin. That's fine, Luke says. I think it's time to change how I'm doing things. Luke decides that the Jedi Academy is a great place for new students to learn the basics, but it will be better for the more advanced students to learn under a master. It's time to usher in a new Jedi Order.
And now it's time to take a break. When we return, I'll talk more about Vision of the Future with Crystal and Thomas. I'm Aaron Moats. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But let me take a moment and recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Thrawn Treason focuses on the future Grand Admiral learning to navigate the politics of the Imperial military. But when Eli Vanto brings him a warning from the unknown regions, Thrawn must decide whether to return to the Chiss ascendancy or remain loyal to the Emperor. It's Thrawn Treason by Timothy Zahn. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats, and today I'm joined by Crystal and Thomas from the TK331 podcast to talk about the book Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn, the second book in the Hand of Thrawn duology. So, first question, why wasn't this a trilogy? Why was this a 390-page book and then a 700-page book? And if it was to make it a trilogy, I think I came up with two places that Thrawn could have stopped this.
Thrawn?
Or, sorry,
You mean
Zahn.
Zahn?
Yeah. That
We've done
Zahn
that
could have
too.
stopped this.
I remember I read somewhere that originally this was supposed to be one book, and then Zahn wanted to make it into two. And I wonder if just they didn't want to do a third book because that would just be... I think the license was coming up to expire soon, and they need to get this done before all of that happened. So I think part of it was just things outside of Zahn's control in making this 2 books instead of 3.
I agree. It either should have been 3 books or we should have cut out some subplots. Like it needed to be more streamlined.
I think... Now this one may be too abrupt, but I think he could have stopped this book when Mara enters the command room with Park and Fel, and you're seeing it from Luke's perspective, and all of a sudden you see Luke say, Mara vanished. She
Luke
disappeared.
goes full Anakin.
Yeah.
That would be a good cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Right. Now, like I said, maybe that was a little too abrupt. But the other place I could see where they could do it is after the fake Grand Admiral Thrawn lets Han and Lando go from Bastion. And then having Han and Lando discuss what just happened on their way back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both of those would have been good points. The book's too long.
It is a lengthy
Says the
book.
one rereading Wheel of Time right now.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows this about me. Maybe not necessarily the people listening to me right now, but I prefer a more streamlined situation. So it's kind of at odds with, like, I usually quite like Zahn's writing for Star Wars, but this one, it was just not svelte enough for me.
I'll tell you my process for doing these shows, because I am probably not the best person to emulate if you want to do a book podcast. And that is, I am terrible at taking notes. So I just don't. I do all of it from memory after I read the book.
Oh my God.
That's impressive.
That is impressive.
And all I have is like the book beside me. And if I think of something, I'll just sort of flip to it and maybe look it over for 2 or 3 minutes to jar my memory. And like you're saying, Crystal, there is just too much going on in this book.
Like in this plot summary, we didn't even talk about
The clones.
the whole clones subplot. Baron Sunterfell's clones who are deeply in love with the soil and just want to be
Duds.
farmers.
Yep. We didn't talk about the Imperial intelligence operatives that are going up against one of Card's operatives in the capital of Bothawi. And man, do they have a long cat and mouse game
Yes.
in
Yes.
this story.
It's so much fun, but it is unneeded. That'd be one of the things I would cut
Yeah.
from this book if I had to.
For sure.
And Wedge and Corrin are there for a little while.
Yeah.
And then they get called away to be with Bella Bliss.
Yeah, they just get called away before the end of what they're doing.
And the woman who's there is like, "Are you serious right now?" Like,
Or like I love Ghent. I think he's such a wonderful character. Once he gives the message to Leia, he needs to be out of the rest of the story. Because he goes to Yaga Minor, and we only see him a handful of times there. The last time he's in this book is when Bella Bliss is attacking. We don't actually see, I don't think, anything of him after that. It's like,
he just seals the door, and for all we know, he's still stuck in
Yeah.
there.
Yep. He's in there with his Funyuns on his
Yeah.
computer.
he's
and
having a great
his-
time.
Yep.
I
Now-
love Ghent, but that part, just give the message to Leia, and then Ghent needs to leave the story.
He's got a Mountain Dew.
Yep.
He's all set.
Absolutely. It is. There, in all seriousness, listener, it's just a really long book. It's just a really big book, and a lot of things happen. It could have been 2 full books.
Yeah, I would have preferred it being 2 books, but I'm also someone who Dune is no easy read. I love Wheel of Time. I really like really long, intense books. So that part, for the most part, doesn't throw me off. It's when there is a storyline that I'm like, that just didn't need to be there. And there were a couple of small ones in this. The stuff on Bothawi, the stuff with Ghent, and a few other things that if you take out, the book is 400 to 500 pages, is a lot more manageable and digestible. Like, I love a 1,000-page book as long as I feel like every part makes sense.
I'm just going to go on the record and say that while I like Wheel of Time and am rereading it, I think there's stuff in those books that could also be
there
cut out.
absolutely are.
They
Still
don't-
love those books.
I don't think any book ever needs to be 1,000 pages long.
How about 1,200 pages?
That's just an opinion that I have.
So now that we have those caveats out of the way, there were some things to like in this book. There were some things that probably don't work for us in this book. The biggest new thing in this story is Luke and Mara on Nirawan. Thomas, you had alluded to it in our last episode. The different discussions Mara has with Luke. She needles him at times. She likes to tease him at times. But she makes some really good points about the way Luke, for some reason, takes on all this responsibility on his shoulders, almost as if anything that goes wrong with the good guys, for some reason, is Luke's fault. And I really do like the fact that Zahn writes these conversations.
Oh yeah, I agree. Whenever Mara is talking to Luke about all the mistakes he's made, I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I think also there's a part of Zahn that's kind of like needling some of the other authors of the 90s, saying, "You guys messed up. I've got to fix your stuff." And from a better perspective, kind of annoying, whatever. But I really love those conversations, like, because Luke has made many mistakes. He's saved the galaxy countless times, but also made so many mistakes while doing so.
And Mara is saying, hey, like, focus on those specifically. Stop taking so much responsibility for everything onto yourself. Like, you're the only person who can fix all of these things. Like, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Now, there are times when he is the one who is the most qualified as the surviving Jedi Master, but that doesn't mean it needs to always be him. And, like, I think
especially now that he's got all these half-trained Force users just running around the galaxy. He's released them from the Academy. They're out there doing good works or something.
Well, that's actually one thing I think the 90s got really right about Luke is he would start his school. He would try and bring the Jedi back. And I really think that aspect of his characterization from the 90s is perfect and spot on. This is exactly what he would do. Maybe the how they do it is off, but the fact that he would do it is completely correct.
Yeah.
One of my favorite aspects of the conversations they have in this book really have nothing to do with Luke the Jedi. It's Mara talking to Luke about kind of the two relationships, well, one relationship and one infatuation he had in the Legends timeline with Gariel and Callista, and the way Luke feels about it, the way Luke talks about it, is that him being a Jedi, him having all this responsibility, he forced these women away. And Mara just looks at him and says, basically, other people have agency. These women made their own decisions. You just have to accept that they made their decisions. And you have to accept that other people in the galaxy are going to make decisions that maybe you don't agree with, but that doesn't mean that you have to take responsibility if something that they choose to do messes crap up.
Yeah, like in Juice Bakura, Gariel, she chooses to stay on her planet because this is where she can do the most good.
And in the Corellian trilogy, she chooses to help,
even though it
leads ultimately to her death. But from Luke's internal perspective at this point in time, it's almost like he feels like he killed her just because he had a connection to her. And Mara's like, no.
It's very Randolph 4 of him.
Yeah, that's an insane thing to think.
Or if he saved the galaxy again, like for some reason it's Luke's duty to do, Gariel would still be alive. If he would have figured out how to save the galaxy.
If he had just done his job that only he has given himself because he has no official position.
Or like Callista would be able to touch the Force and not have had to leave him because of that. Like he messed up by
It's like, no, Callista would still be a Force ghost haunting some wreckage in space. Maybe.
One of the few times in Legends that we see Luke back away from this, and Thomas, you mentioned it in our previous episode, is in the beginning of the first book of the Black Fleet Crisis, when Luke decides to basically take a sabbatical from the Jedi Academy, and he says he's tired of everyone coming to him and asking him to do things. Now, I'm not sure people do that as much as Luke thinks they do that, but it's at least a version of Luke allowing the rest of the galaxy to run on its own without him overseeing everything.
Yeah, I've got a complicated relationship with that trilogy because I think in some ways Luke is written so well, and in other ways I'm like, what are you doing to my boy? Like, is him wanting to take a step back and take a sabbatical in character? I think so. Is him rebuilding Vader's castle on Coruscant and cutting himself off from everyone and everything in character? No.
He was having a crisis, Tom.
He was. But it was still a wild scene.
Yeah.
Anyway, I really like these conversations, and I do like that Mara forces Luke to rethink what his role in this galaxy is. I think Leia at some point should have done that. I think personally Leia would have done that at some point. And maybe she tried, but the two of them are so close together. You know, it's sort of that you don't see the forest for the trees, and you need an outsider to come in and talk about the situation. What I don't particularly like is how these 2 or 3 conversations ends up being like their flirtations, I guess, the way they flirt with each other. Crystal, I know you like this part of the story.
It's tough.
Folks, you could hear the sigh. You could hear the sigh.
There were parts of this that I did really like. This is not at all a criticism or an insult, but this premise of these two people being alone and like making their way through this rugged territory and on this like very life or death, very important mission, and having these connections when they have downtime or even when they don't. Like one of these conversations takes place while they're balancing against each other above a horde of fire creepers just passing through. Like all of that stuff, like that's fan fiction. I mean, that's like, I'm not saying that as a criticism. That's some of the best fan fiction is like put two characters alone in an isolated situation and see what happens, see what kind of things they talk to each other about, see what revelations they have. But I just don't see how they get from here, where Mara has dropped a variety of truth bombs on Luke, to where they're at by the time they're about to die in that flooding cave. I don't see how you make the leap from there to let's get married.
I think
it's not a flirtation.
It is an odd place for Luke to propose in the flooding
It's also
cave.
a very Luke place, though, I feel like. I think for me, it's just Zahn's trying to say that was the start, and then how they connect so much, they see so much of each other in the Force that they realize what they mean to each other. It's just, he doesn't write romance very well is the problem. I think that's his greatest weakness as a writer.
It's a book that's too full of other plots to go from like start to finish in a romance.
Yeah.
That's it. Like there's just not enough space in this series.
Make it a third book. Give this plot a little more time to breathe.
Yeah, I wish they had something more like fun and flirty happening in those caves. Some silly romance tropes or something. Like, oh, I need to go like wash my hair in this stream because I'm so greasy after being here for like 2.5 weeks. And then Luke starts thinking like, I really like her hair, even when it's greasy. That's interesting. Why do I feel that way?
Yeah. The big thought you get from Luke was jealous of Lando and his possible relationship with Mara that, of course, Zahn then turned around and made it so that it wasn't actually a relationship. It was some undercover scheme they were running for Card.
It was funny when we were discussing Children of the Jedi. I had put forth the idea of like how Mara and Lando might not really be together, and you were like, "She's wearing his shirt" or something like that.
And they specifically referenced the shirt in this book,
and that's why I brought it up because like just remember this. Eventually, Zahn will turn this around.
And like I didn't like how he turned it around, because Mara's whole thing to Luke, which I agree is great and it's a good conversation, is that these women who were with you in whatever variety of ways, they made their own choices both to be with you and to do the things that they did. And what it gets turned into is that like I did not like the Mara Lando relationship. I did not understand the method he was using to flirt with her when that whole thing started. But at the same time, it feels like Zahn is saying, well, I didn't like that relationship, and so I'm going to make sure it didn't happen. It's like Mara can't have had another relationship in order for this one with Luke to work.
Right. If Mara wanted to have a relationship with Lando, she was absolutely free to have a relationship with Lando.
Yeah.
I think what it is everything in these caves that Mara says to Luke, I love, and I think it's fantastic, and some of Zahn's most, not necessarily best, but some of his more interesting ideas. But the stuff about Mara and her romance on the dark side are some of his weaker ideas.
The dark side stuff is very weird.
Yeah.
because we come to the conclusion here, like Luke comes to the conclusion, that Mara was never dark side.
So the romance stuff was funny to me because I don't think it's well written. This is the one part that I just did not like. I just don't like at all.
Yeah.
That Luke fell to the dark side, but not fully, and that's how he was able to come back. And Luke decides that because Mara believed in the system of the Empire, but not the cruelty, I guess, or not the evil part of the Empire, that she never fell to the dark side. I mean, at least Mara at one point says, look, I still did these things. You know,
Yeah.
You can't absolve me fully because I still did things in the Emperor's name.
And Luke says, well, yes, but you were serving someone else. You weren't serving yourself. And that means that it wasn't really dark side. No, I'm sorry. If the person you're serving is Palpatine, it is a version of serving yourself.
Yeah.
It is dark side.
And I feel like Zahn tries to kind of almost show this in his books about Mara, Choices of One, and
Allegiances.
yes, Allegiances. And I get what he's doing in those books, but still, just I thought those were probably his two weakest.
I just
books of
don't
Star
buy
Wars.
it. Like, the thing that was interesting about her was that she is actually sort of on the path to being a reformed Imperial. Like, how often do we really get a reformed Imperial or reformed dark side user, someone who actually comes back and has to, like, live in the world and actually, like, do some version of penance?
And
but this cuts that. Like, she doesn't have to do penance.
She still assassinated, executed Imperials in the Emperor's name. They weren't sent to trial for anything. Emperor Palpatine just told her, kill these guys, and she went
They're
and killed them.
bad.
And to your point about the Reformed Imperials, I would almost argue Paleon is in some ways a Reformed Imperial, and that's why he is my favorite Imperial officer, because he does get that story that Zahn is taking from Mara right now.
All right,
Well,
I don't want to bash the book completely. You know, I do want to talk about some of the stuff that we do like. And,
Yeah.
and Thomas,
still think
I
it's a
think
great
probably you like more of this story than what Crystal and I do.
Yeah, that often happens between Crystal and I.
Yeah.
Especially for books in the 90s, because these were so foundational to my childhood and teenage years, and I read them. I couldn't tell you how many times that just I have such a nostalgic bias and blindness. Like, I can recognize the faults of this book. I don't care. I still think it's a wonderful book.
So the first time I read through this one, I mean, I was like eating it alive. Like, I could not stop reading. Zahn's plots are like that. You just want to find out what is going to happen. Like, are they going to figure this out? Even though if you take a step back, you feel like, you know, the New Republic's not going to lose this one. But you wonder if there's going to be some kind of little twist. You wonder if there's going to be something goes wrong enough that they're going to have this lasting wound that will carry forward. And that threat, I feel, is credible. And that's what keeps you reading. Like, it's so interesting. And it's, even though it's so long, it feels very fast paced.
Thomas, what exactly was the offer that Park and Fell made to Mara? And it sort of relates to the threats they talk about in the unknown regions. Do you think Zahn himself had ideas for how the saga was going to move forward on the Legends timeline?
So, if I remember correctly, there was this came out, I think it was last summer. There was a fascinating YouTube documentary about the New Jedi Order that's like 10 or 15 hours long, and it's 7 or 8 parts. And it's just interviews from everyone who worked on this or were connected to it in some way. And there were parts where Zahn was also interviewed for it, even though he didn't write in the New Jedi Order. And I don't remember if it was him speaking or someone speaking about Zahn, but basically he had ideas of what was out there, and then the NJO kind of washed over what he was hoping or planning to do with some of those ideas, depending on how you feel about the Vong, either a good thing or a bad thing. I'm kind of a bit of both. I think the Vong are a fascinating villain. I also would have been very interested to see what Zahn would have done in the unknown regions in a Vong-free world. And we do see bits and pieces of that in Survivor's Quest, which you're going to do soon. And also, I think even some of those ideas go with like the Grisk in Disney canon as well. So what did they offer me of just in terms of like, did Zahn have an idea? Yes. Was it completely planned out? No. I think he knew, because this is how Star Wars works. Like, he might come back, he might not come back. And as for...
He wanted to leave himself enough breadcrumbs to use in a future story.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I can get that. Because at first, when Park and Fel are talking to Mara and just telling her about these things that are out there, and they just say, well, join us. And I just didn't understand, why they would single this one woman out.
Especially since she had one interaction with Thrawn that did not go well.
Right. And she was on the side that helped defeat him.
Yeah. They do claim that Thrawn held Mara in incredibly high regard.
Well, he didn't talk like it.
No, he did not. That felt like a bit of a Zahn retcon to me, because I think he wanted Mara to be more important and involved in this story. And one way to do that is if Thrawn actually thinks she would be useful to him. And actually, one thing I thought that they said that made a lot of sense was her kind of connection between... She can go between the Empire, the Republic, and the Fringe in a way that few characters can. So from that regard, it makes sense to start with her. But I still think they played up too much of how Thrawn thought of her.
Okay, I could buy that. Back with the New Republic. We get Leia and Pelion's meeting. They start hashing out what the Empire, the Imperial Remnant, might want when it comes to a peace treaty. And of course, at the very end of the book, Pelion and Gavrisum signed the treaty. One of the things they talk about is the Empire holding on to the systems they already have, if those systems want to remain with them. It's a very quick treaty in the book, because after the events of Yaga Minor, Luke doesn't come back. Luke and Mara come back, I believe it says 15 days later. So in 15 days, you hammer out a peace treaty between these two foes that have been going at it now for 30 plus years. I understand some of the requests that Pelion makes, that what the Imperial Remnant wants to hold on to. I don't know if that's very realistic in the long run. What did you guys think of first the meeting with Leia and then the eventual treaty that we get to?
I think the meeting with Leia is actually one of my favorite scenes in this book.
It's my favorite scene in this story.
It's fantastic. And I love that. I think Pelion, I don't think he tells him, I think he just thinks that, like, he's facing an Alderaanian, a Kamasi, and an Ogre. The three people who probably have the most grievances against the Empire, and how just the symbology of it is just really powerful. And I agree with that thought. Like, it's great that those are the three people who kind of are the first ones to get the crack at this. And it's a really interesting... Like, Pelion has been, for lack of a better word, the enemy of the New Republic since the original Thrawn trilogy. Technically longer than that, but from a reader's perspective, it's been that long. Like, we've known him as an enemy of the New Republic for that long. And it's fascinating that he and Leia, one of the heroes, maybe arguably the biggest hero of the Rebellion New Republic, finally get to meet. And I love seeing that kind of meeting happen in a story between these two just gigantic forces. And they're very respectful of each other. They both understand that this is just the start of the process. They both know they can't give everything that they want, but they're willing to work together in a way that I think is wonderful to read.
I think that part of the treaty says that the systems that the Empire controls will get a say as to whether or not they stay with the Empire or not. And I believe Pelion says they have about 1,000 systems that they still
Something
control. Like that. Personally, I think if that's part of the treaty, now the Imperial Remnant goes down to about 10. I just can't see where that many systems would willingly want to stay under Imperial rule.
Well, now, isn't part of the treaty also that there's like free trade and passage between the Empire and the New Republic? The reverse is also true, that New Republic systems can leave and join the Imperial Remnant if they want. Like, it's just not, to me, it does not seem like Pelion's or even Disra's empire is still Palpatine's empire. The way that they behave has changed enough that those 1,000 systems are like fine, mostly fine with the way that they do things.
I can't believe the New Republic would be willing to just allow the Moffs to just stay in control without, one, either answering for what they've done, or two, demanding that the systems hold some sort of elections,
Vote.
I guess,
Yeah.
as to
I
who
like
they
to
would want to be ruling them.
I like to think they do, but Zahn doesn't go into that, and that may just be because this book is long enough. I need to wrap it up.
He
Sure.
wants to button it up, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Aaron. I think one of the things that hurts both the Rebellion and the New Republic often is that they feel that they, in order to adhere to their morals and their ethics, they always have to give second chances. I mean, how many former Imperials defected and joined the Rebellion? Lots. And they don't get, they don't get prosecuted. They don't get put on trial for the most part. So I picture it as they're entering into this new era of cooperation with this now much lesser force, with the idea that everybody's going to be on their best behavior and will deal with it if they're not.
And I wonder if they're also hoping, like, over time, more and more systems will leave the Empire and join the Republic until the Empire essentially doesn't exist anymore, like as a long-term thought.
Yeah, like maybe it will get whittled down to 10.
But that's what
Everyone-
Pelion was worried about at the beginning of the first book.
That's true. So it makes this all seem like an exercise in futility.
Yeah.
He might as well have just fought.
Do you think that the Grand Admiral Thrawn's scheme, that Tierce and Flem would have eventually dropped Disra? Because it seemed by the end of this book, in my opinion, that they needed Disra a lot less than Moff Disra needed them.
I agree. I think Tierce especially would have been pushing to get rid of him at some point because he's so annoying to Tierce. Like Tierce treats Disra kind of like an irritating fly that's buzzing around him and getting in his way.
Yeah, but I do think that Disra does a good job of this book of showing how valuable he is to Tierce and Flem, because, like, in terms of the political machinations, Disra knows so much more than the other two. So I think Tierce would have dropped Disra the first chance he felt he truly had, but I don't think Flem would have wanted to.
I do think Tierce at times thinks Disra is thinking small. Like, Disra is only thinking of himself and not the Empire.
And Tierce was programmed to think of the Empire.
Yeah.
Right. Tierce the clone. Boy, Zahn loves his clones, by the way.
does.
He didn't like the Emperor Reborn, but man, does he love his clones.
It was funny. So when you read these books the first time, the thing you kept always saying is you wanted to be cons.
Uh-huh.
And I kept saying, there's still a twist coming, and that twist being that Tierce is a clone with some of Thrawn put into him as well.
Who cares?
And
Sorry.
usually, like, I just don't care about that. And I actually really like that. I think it's not as impactful as a twist of, oh, Flem was Thrawn all along, but it's still an interesting idea
It's a
that
double con.
yeah, it's just still an interesting idea that Thrawn actually put this plan into place when he was around, and then decided, you know what, Tierce and clones like him aren't going to work, and I thought, so I'm going to cancel this. But I actually kind of like the fact that clone Tierce still survived and tried to make it work anyways.
Between the original Thrawn trilogy and then these books, there is so much talk about how the clones eventually go mad or have their mental capacities diminish over time, because these books, of course, were published before the prequel trilogy. But apparently that's not the case with Sunter Fell's clones that are just farmers out on Pacrick Minor. I mean, they're perfectly sane.
Baron Sunterfell is so special, is the thing. And one of his clones could never go mad. They just want to work with the dirt and be good farmers.
It was funny. So in that the New Day Order documentary I mentioned earlier, there was an interview with, I think it was Stackpost talking, and he was calling Zahn about something completely unrelated. And then at some point, the conversation turns to, hey, so do you want to hear this character is created? And Stackpole tells Zahn about Fell, and Fell's like, oh my God, I love this character. I will use him in everything going forward.
Zahn.
Zahn.
Fell. Loved.
Zahn loved Fell.
Which is so, like, it's so funny to me because I've seen, like, stories about Fell and appearances of a different, like, a fake Fell, whatever. And I just, every time he appears, I'm like, what is it with this guy? Like, why does everyone want to include this guy?
It was so funny that we met the clones of Fell first in this book before you met Fell, and you were like, oh my God, we still met Fell, but we met his clones. And then Fell shows up 100 pages later, and you're like, what?
It's just very strange.
Yeah,
it is. And listener, I know we've been a little snarky here talking about this book, but I just want you guys to know that these are two enjoyable reads. This book was an enjoyable read. Spectre of the Past was an enjoyable read. You know, sometimes it's just fun to nitpick a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially, like, we all hold Zahn in such a high regard. Sometimes you have to nitpick when he does make a mistake.
I think that's the thing. He's a really good writer. So we could sit here singing his praises for half an hour, for sure. Like, we know what he's strong at. He portrays characters generally well. He has strong plots. He has good, clean writing. He doesn't spend a lot of time with, like, flowery language that's distracting from the things that are important. But would it be, like, so much fun to talk about? I don't know. That's just my opinion.
And actually, one thing I do want to mention, so, like, we've talked about, like, he got Luke and Mara, some of it right, some of it wrong. One thing I think Zahn wrote wonderfully in this book was Leia. Leia on the bridge of the New Republic cruiser when she takes it over is one of my all-time favorite Leia moments. It's just so perfect.
And when she does damage to the Falcon with her lightsaber and just thinks, well, I hope Han will forgive me, but I really got to do this right now. This is the only way to stop everybody from opening fire on each other, is if I am in incredible danger.
Yeah, I think it's Mara and Luke, there are problems, but I think he wrote Leia and Han just so wonderfully in these two books.
Yeah. That is the Leia that you see in the original trilogy when she's coming out of the trash compactor in A New Hope and she takes charge, when she's in charge at Echo Base in Empire Strikes Back, when she's in charge, well, not in charge, but a woman of action there on Endor and just runs over and jumps on the speeder bike. Leia gets stuff done.
Yeah, some authors really struggle to write Leia, but Zahn is not one of them.
And I think it's the smart move to be like, she's not just doing politician stuff right now. She has to, like, get into it. Like, she has to bring out her ambassador side to, like, actually go out into the galaxy and fix things rather than stay on Coruscant and just debate with a bunch of people in a room.
So it's about time to wrap up, but one little thing, Crystal, everyone showing up at Yaga Minor at the end of this story, literally everyone showing up at the same exact time.
And there is no reason for them all to be timed so perfectly, like one after the other. It doesn't make sense.
I actually thought that Zahn did a decent job of explaining why some of them were there for this.
Well, yeah, okay, so Bella Bliss is the one who's got the plan to attack.
Has to enlist Booster Tarek for some reason because he needs an Imperial Star Destroyer, even though the New Republic have a bunch of Imperial Star Destroyers.
And ones that are definitely in better condition than Boosters.
Yeah. Like, I do love that this leads to Booster repainting his Star Destroyer, which you haven't seen yet. But eventually he's going to have a very different colored Star Destroyer, so this can never happen again.
Okay, well, I was really hoping that Booster was going to die in this whole situation.
But yeah, Ghent gets there first. Then Bella Bliss shows up. Then Tierce and Disra and Flim show up. Rogue Squadron is out there at the edge of the system, sort of running interference. Everyone shows up here.
Card and his weird alien ships. We didn't even talk about the way that those aliens use the Force. So that's a can of worms that I don't think we have time to open.
Yeah. Card gets there instantaneously. You used to... We always talk about how hyperspeed or hyperspace moves at the speed of plot. And yet Zahn specifically writes that these Ang-T monks have some sort of way to use hyperspace where they can instantaneously pop up wherever they want to be.
Sounds like a Mario hitting a block and getting a flower situation to me.
It is. This is one of my 3 favorite times where Zahn has everyone shows up at exactly the same time. My favorite is still in what is my favorite Zahn book, Heir to the Empire, the first one, and that is when everyone shows up at Card's hideout on Mercury at the same exact time.
And that's even referenced in this book, or in Inspector of the Past, I should say.
Yeah.
Nothing is not referenced in these books. He really dug deep. He mentions the Kella ship at some point. He mentions the Drachas.
Luke's like, I don't like bugs.
Crystal, someone in this story says that Prince Shizor was an adequate foe for Darth Vader. I've never wanted to strangle a book more.
My soul shriveled.
Especially after the Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy, Zizor. Shadows is one thing. The Bounty Hunter Wars even just stuff.
I want to look at it like this. Tom and I have talked about how it almost feels like the publisher came to Zahn and was like, we're wrapping up this era. We need you to put a bow on it. But I think the nicer way to think of it is that these 2 books are almost a love letter to all of the books of the 90s.
Sure.
A reminder of all of the fun and silly times that we had in all of these stories. I think that's a kind of nice way to look at it.
Yeah, I've said this to you at least, I think on our episode we talked about these. I've always thought that the EU has a few places where it would have been a good end. And this is one of those times. I think actually if the EU had stopped here, I would have been, for the most part, satisfied with how the story ended up.
Yeah, the conflict with the Empire is resolved. The remnants are gone.
Yeah, this would have been a good stopping place. The problem is that things like Young Jedi Knights and Junior Jedi Knights, which take place after this, had already come out at the time. So there's no stopping this train.
And on that, listener, it's time to go. So if you have something you'd like to share with me, a question, opinion, comment, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And don't forget to send in your favorite Star Wars character grouping. I love reading what you guys email me. Crystal, Thomas, thanks again for joining me today, and thank you so much for coming on these last 2 shows to talk about the Hand of Thrawn duology.
Thanks for having us. It was a ton of fun.
Yeah, we team-ups like this are a lot of fun.
What's coming up on the TK331 podcast, and how can people reach you?
So next up, we are starting the Young Jedi Knights with Heirs of the Force. That is coming out on August 3rd. And then on August 17th, we are reading The Final Exit in Tales from the Empire in quite possibly our least favorite short story we've read yet.
It's a fun episode.
It's a weird story.
You'll want to tune in. And if you want to reach us, if you have a question or a comment or feedback, you can email us at tk331podcast@gmail.com. And you can also reach us on Twitter at tk331podcast.
Folks, if you like more long-form discussion about these Star Wars Legends books, I heartily encourage you to listen to the TK331 podcast.
Thank you. We get a little long-winded.
And I'm spicy, as you can clearly tell from this episode.
Well, coming up on my next episode, I'll be wrapping up the New Republic era with Survivor's Quest, another story by Timothy Zahn in the Season of Zahn. You can look forward to that episode coming out on August 8th. Thank you so much for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Motes. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in legends.